This critical analysis of The End is Nigh is split up into various sections. The later parts of the video feature a large number of gameplay and plot spoilers, but the earlier parts will only discuss the beginning of the game. If you become interested in The End is Nigh after watching part of this video, I encourage you to not move on to future sections until you try the game out for yourself.
It's possible. I don't blame them, so yeah, that was the only thing. That was the only minor bump.
Edmund McMillen is one of the stars of the modern independent video game scene. After years of making small flash games for websites like Newgrounds, he got his big break through a publishing deal with Microsoft for his first major title, Super Meat Boy, made with Tommy Rafinis. The game has since been hailed as not only one of the best indie games ever made, but one of the best platforming games ever made. About a decade later, however, he would outdo himself with the help of Tyler Glale. 2017's The End is Nigh is a title which not only learned from and improved upon its spiritual predecessor, but undertook a number of new design challenges. This time, McMillen didn't just make one of the best platformers of all time, he made one of the greatest video game experiences of all time. And yeah, that may sound like a gross overstatement, but this is no exaggeration. Counter to its own name, The End is Nigh does so many things flawlessly that it feels more like a new beginning, a standard for the interactive medium which titles of all genres can learn from. This isn't to say that the game doesn't do platforming well though. Finding fantastic level design in The End is Nigh is easy. Arid Flats 15, for example, features frog-like enemies that were introduced in the previous room. The exit is too high for Ash to reach on his own, requiring players to jump off a frog's head to reach it. The problem is that there are 3 frogs who all track and leap towards the player, and poorly timed moves could result in you jumping right into a frog's path. What was once a simple jump becomes far more complex as players learn the behavior of these frogs and considers all of their possible actions. Situations like this demonstrate that The End is Nigh is far more deliberate gameplay than Super Meat Boy. In that game, most levels had fairly linear paths with a single progression route and little planning on the player's end, but actually managing to get through those paths was in itself challenging. In other words, the only thing really being tested in Super Meat Boy was execution. Here, however, there's a second form of difficulty at play, evaluation difficulty. This factors in when players need to thoroughly consider an action before actually executing it. Games which test evaluation focus on decision making, plan development, and risk assessment. Strategy games, puzzle games, and JRPGs focus on evaluation almost exclusively, testing player ability to plan and assess their circumstances instead of their mechanical skill at the game. Typically, executing an action in these sort of games is as simple as selecting an option from a menu or choosing a space on a grid. The challenge comes from players needing to evaluate their situation and figure out what actions to do when, taking into account the possible risks and consequences of those actions. The End is Nigh tests both execution and evaluation simultaneously, finding a sort of healthy balance between the two. In order to clear levels, players will not only have to master the mechanics of the game, but also strategize and find the best paths to take. Retrograde 5 is a fantastic example of this. A series of platforms continuously move either up or down, all adorned with spikes on top and hooks on their sides. Players must use the hooks exclusively to cross the gap, and there are a number of ways to do that. Regardless of the chosen path, getting through the challenge will still prove difficult in its own right. Of course, variety isn't the only metric of good level design. My 3D Mario video mentioned that platforming games need to find a balance between focused linear challenges with a single path and more open scenarios with multiple paths. That's because both of these extremes have a clear strength and weakness. If a level is designed around a single solution, it forces players to learn to master a specific thing, resulting in incredible satisfaction when the challenge is cleared. But it can also make repeat playthroughs a bit less exciting because there's nothing new to do here. If a level is designed around multiple pathways, however, it could suffer from the exact opposite problem, where replayability is enhanced, but the guaranteed mastery is lost. The End is Nigh uses both of these design philosophies in areas where it makes sense. Levels like Retrograde 5 feature broad levels with broad design, but these optional secret levels, known as the Future, are designed to be cleared once and only once in a particular playthrough of a game. The first Future level exemplifies focused level design fantastically by subverting player expectations. The exit is on the bottom left, and getting there requires jumping off a spring, onto a hook, leaping between these things, and making your way across the bottom to the exit. The exciting part comes when you reach the bottom and are likely to be stuck with no way to cross this gap. That's because when you jump on the spring, it starts falling down to the bottom of the screen. You don't just have to clear this insanely hard platforming challenge, you have to do it quickly. After clearing this room, the next room expands on the previous room's design by having you activate the falling platform manually, backtrack to the start of the level, then return to that platform before jumping to the exit. This room couldn't have existed without McMillen being certain that every player at this point knew how to clear the prior room. Teaching through design still exists in the more open navigational levels, however. When players enter the SS Exodus, they're introduced to these bouncing cannonballs in a fairly safe environment. They can stand on this platform and observe the cannonballs' behavior without risking death. Clearing the next room requires jumping on the cannonballs to reach a higher ledge. Later, jumping on cannonballs is used to cross a gap. By the end of the area, you're jumping from cannonball to cannonball to cannonball to reach the end of the stage. But these aspects, while phenomenal, aren't anything new. A number of games have done great things for platforming, and only platforming games stand to benefit from mastery in that area. The End is Nigh's true greatest strength is with completion, something which games of all genres and classifications can benefit from. This quality of the game becomes more and more apparent as it progresses, but even at the start, this game proves to be something special.
Okay, we're going to load up one of my favorite games here. Here we have The End is Nigh.
The End is Nigh begins as a retro-styled 2D platformer inspired by the likes of the NES, Game Boy, and Commodore 64. Commentating over it is Ash, our protagonist, who is currently playing the retro game, also called The End is Nigh. Players assume control over the game Ash is playing in what is an incredibly difficult platforming challenge. It's possible to test out the game's controls within the relatively risk-free left side of the screen, but players will eventually have to jump to the right. Due to lack of experience with the game, players are most likely going to fail before reaching the end.
Oh god, no, this can't be broke. Here, let me get the cartridge out. Okay. Oh no, it's still not working. Oh fuck! Fuck, what am I gonna do? Fuck!
Now the game really begins. Ash lives in a post-apocalypse as a black blob of a being with no limbs and a missing eye, and in the intro he mentions two goals. He wants to fix his End is Nigh game cartridge, and he wants to find a friend. Naturally, acquiring this friend involves finding three separate friend pieces: the head, the heart, and the body. In addition to these three primary collectibles, most levels also have a hidden collectible tumor. There are also hidden retro-style cartridges similar to the one that started the game. Unlike Super Meat Boy, which featured a world map and level selection screen, The End is Nigh features a mostly cohesive and interconnected world. It is only mostly cohesive because there are rooms which are designed to act as points of no return, with the entirety of the hollows being the prime example. But these rooms serve a purpose, forcing players to rethink their choices even more than normal and marginally raising the area's evaluation difficulty. In essence, it raises the stakes of players' circumstance and forces them to think and play a bit more cautiously. Missing a collectible after a point of no return ensures that players will have to replay an area from its start all the way up to the room with the missing tumor before even having another chance at collecting it. In the first few areas, these points of no return are extremely rare, giving them a fairly low evaluation difficulty. With knowledge of the lowered stakes, players will likely approach completion of these areas in many different ways, based almost entirely on their own personal metrics for completion. Completion of a game is very different from completion of any other art form. When a movie ends, for example, there's nothing else to see. The screen goes black, the lights turn on, and you leave the theater. In essence, all of the content was consumed before the conclusion of the film. With a game, however, players can often reach the conclusion of the title before seeing the entirety of the game's content. This is largely due to the interactivity of the medium. In a decision-focused adventure game, for example, concluding the title would happen after players make a series of decisions. They make one choice, which leads to another choice, so on and so forth until the credits roll. Completion of a game would, in theory, necessitate making every possible decision that a player could ever make, because that would be the only way to bear witness to all of the game's content. Most players would never do this. Because completion of a game is so flexible in this way, it can only be viewed through the lens of metrics which players set themselves. As a result, games which may appear complete to some may actually be incomplete to others. You may have reached all of Super Mario World's 96 exits, but did you get every dragon coin? You may have collected all of the bonus and DK coins in Donkey Kong Country 3, but did you do it in the game's secret hard mode? You may have spared every enemy in Undertale, but did you try killing them all too? Because of this, game developers need to make sure that there is proper incentive to complete aspects of their title. If there isn't a reward at the end, the hours spent may appear to have been worthless, and players may feel as if their time was wasted. The easiest way developers can try to give incentive to further complete a title is through menus and UI elements. Massive RPGs like Xenoblade Chronicles do this with a checklist full of various side quests, which suggest to players that the game will be complete when every box is ticked. The main problem with this approach is that it hinges on the fact that completing this list on its own will be satisfying, which isn't always the case. Another way to give incentive is to provide some sort of plot-related reason to complete the game. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse is a perfect example of this approach by providing a different final sequence depending on whether all of the game's dark magic is collected. This works well for those who wish to 100% complete the game, but if a player is stuck at 99% completion, their experience with the game's final moments will effectively be the same as a player with 50%, which may lead to increased frustration. Finally, developers could choose to lock optional content behind completion barriers. Mario vs. Donkey Kong did this with its extra stages, which unlocked sequentially as more and more presents were collected. This approach's clear benefit is that it rewards players with more fun content over a span of completion levels, but it has an extremely minor issue which can make it a bit less satisfying. Because we can see all of the unlock requirements on the screen, it may not feel as satisfying to unlock them because we see it coming. With the plot-related metric, there's an element of surprise that simply isn't present with the menu. Most games cannot easily be categorized by these techniques, as most developers tend to utilize multiple of these strategies at the same time. Unfortunately, however, the implementation of these completion incentives tend to amplify these problems rather than actually solve them. The previously mentioned Shantae game, for example, uses UI elements to show players how much dark magic they have left to collect, but that doesn't change the fact that collecting dark magic on its own isn't always fun. The only way to really solve these problems is to find a way to implement all three of these strategies in a way where those strategies complement each other. At this early point in The End is Nigh, the main incentive for getting tumors are these hungry dudes, hungry dude being a technical term, who are scattered across the world. They each come with a sign next to them adorning a number from 1 to 4. Hungry dude number 4 is located right above Ash's house and requires a whopping 300 tumors in order to be satisfied. Thankfully, hungry dude number 1 only requires 70 tumors, with each hungry dude requiring a slightly higher number. Each of these dudes take Ash to a level in the area I mentioned before, the future, with a special iron cartridge as a reward at the end. With some fancy math, however, it becomes fairly evident that there couldn't possibly be 300 tumors in the game if there was only 1 tumor in every level, as with 6 20-room areas and 3 15-room areas, there would only be 165 tumors in the game's entirety. This is where so-called mega tumors come in, which are worth 5 tumors each. These are hidden in secret areas throughout the game world. In order to find these hidden rooms, players will need to look for gaps in walls or seemingly out-of-place hooks, anything which looks even remotely suspicious. Finding these rooms can be incredibly difficult, but clearing the challenge within is even harder. Given the immense challenge of obtaining these megatumors from both an execution and evaluation standpoint, the more valuable collectible seems like a reasonable reward, given that they bring players a few steps closer to that elusive 300 tumor goal. With all of these different options the player has, the focus of the game becomes that much more clear. Just as evaluation difficulty is tested when players have to find the best path through a room or when considering whether or not to collect tumors within those levels, it is also tested when considering how to approach the optional challenge of collecting 300 tumors and clearing all of the future stages. It not only challenges players in simple, short micro scenarios, but also challenges players in a macro sense, forcing players to constantly think about the bigger picture with every decision they make. But there's one major problem here that is yet to be explained away. There's no apparent purpose for collecting tumors aside from this completely optional and disconnected part of the game. If a player just wants to beat the game and doesn't want to mess with this optional content, then they presumably won't ever have to revisit older levels. Why then should they care about the larger world if all they need to do is make it to the end of these 3 fairly linear paths? Well, let's ask Ash's new friend.
What? Oh, fuck. What the fuck? How the fuck does the Earth die twice?
Somehow, against all odds, the world managed to get even worse than before. These final areas after the world ends for a second time are, in effect, the equivalent of Super Meat Boy's Dark Worlds, taking levels which existed in the past and altering the layout slightly to amplify the challenge greatly. Levels which used to only require basic platforming skills now require much more precision from the player. Enemies and obstacles from later worlds in the past are brought into endgame worlds to amplify the challenge even more, such as this corrupted expanding mass or these hungry fish-like creatures. Something strange happens in these areas, however. When players die, Ash not only explodes into chunky bits like always, but a ghost appears in the spot where he died, fading away a few seconds into the following attempt. This ghost wasn't there in the past because it represents something very specific, a small piece of Ash's soul being torn from him and mercilessly killed. In essence, these ghosts represent the death of one of the tumors Ash collected in the past. In the future, these tumors act as your life counter. If the counter runs out, that's game over, kicking players all the way back to Ash's house in Anguish, or the last warp point. Life counters aren't anything new to games. In fact, they're a staple of the medium. They were conceived back in the 1970s and early 80s when arcades were more popular than home consoles as a means of limiting a player's time with the game before having to put more money in the machine. In essence, players were incentivized to play the game well because they stood to lose both their progress and their time. A skilled player could play for longer by spending less money, but they probably had to spend more money initially to become skilled in the first place. The transition to home consoles resulted in the migration of this arguably archaic design philosophy. As console games became more popular, however, game developers shied away from making extremely difficult games with life counters in favor of removing life counters and reducing frustration while still maintaining some element of difficulty. My Wario World video discussed how failure needs to set back the player's progress in some way in order to establish some element of challenge. It also discussed how doing this in ways which feel like wasted time will result in frustration instead of satisfaction. Super Meat Boy was cited as an example of minimizing this frustration by featuring short levels and fast respawn times, both of which return in The End is Nigh. This is a fairly effective solution, but it only tests execution. There's no larger evaluative consideration to make when playing Super Meat Boy because in addition to there not being any sort of path variety within the levels, players can throw themselves at the obstacles in those levels with reckless abandon. It isn't until the end of the stage when the stakes are raised, because it is only at that point when there is substantial progress to be lost. The limited lives system here serves to fix this problem and increase evaluation difficulty. When playing levels in the endgame, every move is a careful consideration. One mistake means the removal of something real, something permanent, something which can never be recovered. It isn't until the end of an area, where a warp point is unlocked, that all tumors are restored back to the player. Originally, Edmund and Tyler wanted to design The End is Nigh to always have this limited lives counter. Players would start with a single life, and collecting tumors throughout the game would increase that life count, serving to lengthen their potential playtime. This idea was scrapped in favor of quarantining off the limited lives section to the final areas of the game. The change ends up working to the game's benefit, however, as it leads to even more decision making that wouldn't have been there otherwise. Even after waking up in the post-apocalypse, players can revisit the worlds of the past at any time. This means that if they find the endgame worlds too challenging, they can simply go back to the past and pick up a few tumors, granting them those precious extra chances when tackling the devious challenges these areas dish out. But which tumor should they pick up? Should they play through all of the past worlds again and collect every tumor along the way? Or should they seek out the larger and more valuable mega tumors? Should they play through an early game world like the Overflow in its entirety just to grab one or two missing tumors? Or should they tackle a more challenging world like Golgotha, which has more remaining tumors that are much harder to nab? In the early game, players chose how many tumors to collect based on their own personal completion metrics. They could have chosen to get 300 tumors or 0 tumors with absolutely no effect on the experience with the main progression path. At this point in the game though, the decision is driven by how challenging players want their experience with these endgame areas to be. In theory, a player could beat The End is Nigh with no tumors at all, but this would result in a massive difficulty spike in the endgame due to players only having a single life to work with. Meanwhile, a player who chooses to get every tumor they can in the past will effectively remove the stress that the limited lives aspect brings to the table, but will have paid the price for it by having to make it through some of the most difficult challenges in the entire game. This is, of course, running under the assumption that players even find the areas where these mega tumors are hidden. The only guides a player has when attempting to find these elusive collectibles are some relatively vague UI elements, which only show where a mega tumor is relative to other mega tumors within a particular area. This means that in any given attempt to obtain all mega tumors within an area, players could easily miss one and not know it until after the fact, when they see the gap in the menu. Some of these secrets were also deliberately quarantined off until after the endgame was opened, thanks to the existence of locked gates. Every area in the past has at least one of these gates, with a mega tumor locked behind. The keys for these gates are initially only accessible through one of the final worlds in the past, the machine. Unlocking a gate grants access to another key, however, so there's never a point where a player would be completely unable to unlock a gate. In addition to physical gates with locks and keys, The End is Nigh also uses hidden mechanics to hide secret areas right underneath the player's noses. This area right here is called the Split, and it is a fork in the road with 3 separate paths which each lead to a different friend piece. The 3 paths each have approximately the same difficulty, with players of different skill sets likely finding one path easier than the others. Interestingly, however, each of these paths teach the player about an aspect of their moveset which they may have not known otherwise. In order to access the lower path and reach the hollows, for example, players need to learn about smashing through cracked blocks from above. In order to go right and get to retrograde, players need to launch off of a hook to break through cracked blocks from the side. And to go up and reach the Wall of Sorrow, players need to understand that going through the top of the screen will sometimes lead to a new room. All of these features and abilities were always in the game, but players were never forced to understand them until they hit a literal dead end. This means that while most players will likely walk past this cracked wall in the overflow and not think twice about it, a crafty player could find a secret area if they figure out how to smash through it early. Both of these forms of gating complement each other in a way to make revisiting old areas feel more satisfying. On a first playthrough, a player will most likely see this locked gate and immediately understand that they will have to find a key and then return to this gate in order to get through. This means that when they get the key, they know exactly where they need to go in order to find a mega tumor. But on that journey to get to that locked gate, they are likely to see a lot of hidden hooks, cracked walls, breakable floors, and other hidden secrets that they didn't see before. This, when combined with the intentionally vague menu, forces players to take time to really explore these rooms and look for anything suspicious. Even something as simple as a floating spring could lead to a hidden area. Because of this, revisiting old areas feels rewarding instead of tedious, incentivizing players to go collect missing tumors to make their endgame experience feel a little less impossible. This entire limited live system could be thought of as a massive difficulty slider in a way. This isn't to say that the level design itself changes at all, because it doesn't, but when the player has more lives, it pulls the experience closer to the Super Meat Boy approach of letting players throw themselves at obstacles mindlessly. In essence, a player will have to think about their life counter less when the counter itself is higher, reducing evaluation difficulty by extension. This is in combination with the fact that players who have collected the mega tumors likely are more skilled with the game from an execution standpoint after having to clear some of these incredibly difficult rooms. This brings to light the one major issue with this design philosophy. Completionists are being rewarded for getting tumors, but the reward is ultimately an easier and arguably worse gaming experience. If the player decides not to start Anguish until they collect hundreds and hundreds of tumors, then this brilliant limited live system essentially becomes a non-issue, fading away almost entirely. This issue isn't new to games, it's a really difficult problem to appropriately tackle. Role-playing games are notorious for having abysmal difficulty balancing as a result of this issue. Too often, the reward for completing a difficult task in an RPG is something which makes the game markedly easier, whether it be a special item, a powerful piece of gear, or a boatload of experience points. These rewards feel satisfying to obtain in the short term, but are quite the opposite in the long term. It feels great to kill powerful enemies in one hit and breeze through an area, until you realize that's all you're doing for the rest of the game. While games don't need challenge to be satisfying, games designed around challenge become very boring very quickly when challenge doesn't exist. The latest Zelda game, Breath of the Wild, is one of this problem's worst offenders in recent history. The 4 main dungeons, known as the Divine Beasts, are completely optional, but choosing not to clear a beast results in its boss encounter being moved to right before the final battle with Ganon. In addition, clearing all 4 dungeons results in the final boss losing a large chunk of its health at the start of the fight. This means that the harder boss fight is given to less experienced players, and the easier and less rewarding boss fight is given to more experienced players. It punishes players for playing more of the game. The End is Nigh completely solves this issue as the game comes to a close by crafting an area with an evaluation-focused challenge for players of all life counts, and having completion metrics which reward players in a way which doesn't lower the game's difficulty. As mentioned, the areas of Anguish, Gloom, and Blight were essentially harder versions of the End, the Arid Flats, and the Overflow respectively. These levels used the same level layouts and design of their early game counterparts, but incorporated new elements to increase the overall challenge in one way or another. While this is an interesting twist as it was in Super Meat Boy, it gives these levels a tinge of familiarity as well. It's surprising then to encounter this giant hole in the ground where the split used to be. Crossing the gap is possible, but ultimately bears no fruit. The only way forward is down, into the unknown. Instead of leading to a hard version of the Hollows, however, this hole leads to a completely different area, Ruin. From a world-building standpoint, this area is what remains of the secret areas players likely spent hours exploring in the past. We don't know this from the level design, but the music, being a more aggressive version of the track which played in many of these secret areas, couldn't communicate this more clearly. This seemingly final area features completely original level design while also still having the limited live system that made the prior areas work so well. While this may make the game feel more difficult, it doesn't change the fact that players can still approach challenges carelessly if they have the tumors to sacrifice. But when players make their way through Ruin, they didn't actually finish the area, they only finished half of it.
When I found you attached to a giant glowing orb buried deep beneath the earth, I didn't know what to think. You know, when you left, the world it just got fucked. And you know what? The world was pretty damn fucked to begin with. Part of me wanted revenge for what you had done to my life, and another part wanted to save you from whatever had taken you from me, but... I think I see the whole picture now. When I saw you down there, on that weird, creepy, glowing orb, I think I understand. We're just different people, you and I. As we shared our last exchange, as a final parting gesture, you wiggled your foot at me, and something deep inside me told me it was time to say goodbye.
After thankfully unlocking a warp point labeling the area as Acceptance, the giant ball of energy our best friend turned enemy is attached to appears to grow increasingly unstable. A countdown timer begins to activate, leaving players to figure out where they need to go and figure it out quickly. Continuing left doesn't appear to lead anywhere, so the most logical option appears to be right, back through the area the players just made their way through. While at first this may appear like a simple challenge, it really isn't. One would think that this would be as simple as utilizing the same exact path players used to clear Ruin in the first place, but in reverse, over half of the rooms in the escape sequence must be cleared through completely different means. Ruin 20, for example, is cleared forwards by jumping across a series of platforms while dodging these ghost enemies. If you try and take this exact path in reverse, however, clearing this gap proves impossible. Instead, players need to jump on this launch bomb. Finding these paths quickly is the true challenge of Acceptance, and it is one purely of evaluation. That isn't to say that escaping doesn't require skill and execution, however, because it absolutely does. Ruin 3 in particular is much harder to clear backwards than forwards, purely because of the location of this fish. While the limited live system can certainly be a factor, it takes a backseat to the far more pertinent timer. As with the past areas, the significance of the tumor count is entirely determined by the player's own desire to collect those tumors, but the overall difficulty of this challenge is balanced across players with a wide array of completion metrics. A player with no tumors whatsoever will need to take more time to deliberate than a player with hundreds of tumors, but this is no longer a clear disadvantage on its own. Both the player who has the liberty to more carelessly throw themselves at obstacles and the player who needs to wait and consider their options will take time to evaluate and execute a plan to clear the room. And unlike every other area in the game, time is a key limiting factor in the Acceptance escape sequence. As such, this escape sequence will provide a comparable degree of challenge to players of all kinds. There's a clear emotional benefit as well. Just as a timer can serve to make viewers feel emotionally pressured or tense in an action movie, timers in a video game can serve to make players feel immense pressure or stress, even if the timer is fairly lenient. The Metroid games are a perfect example of incredibly lenient escape sequences still serving a functional purpose by building up stress and releasing it when the player succeeds. One of the best uses of this comes from the unofficial fan-made Metroid II remake, where the timer, represented by a temperature gauge, is designed such that players will barely escape every single time. Knowledge of how the timer works makes the area feel less stressful, but in the moment, players don't know that. The end is nigh isn't so kind, however, and death from the timer running out will be incredibly common. In the final room, there's even a skeleton whose sole purpose is to waste the player's time. I feel so bad for the player whose otherwise successful acceptance run was ruined by this skeleton. While the timer itself isn't cinematic in a way comparable to Mvmt II, there is a related element which could be considered cinematic in a way. As the timer gets closer and closer to zero, the screen begins to shake more and more violently. This mechanic makes playing the game a bit more difficult, especially in the final 30 seconds, but it doesn't serve to complement the gameplay in any meaningful way. Instead, this violent shaking serves to increase the player's emotional investment with the events playing out on screen. It makes players really feel as if the world is ending for the third time, and when the player finally clears the challenge, the payoff feels greater. Is this ending satisfying? Absolutely. This sort of escape sequence works incredibly well as the final act of the game, as it not only provides a comparable level of challenge for all players, but it also has the emotional resonance and satisfaction that the rest of the game otherwise lacks. This feels like the conclusion of the game in a way no other area could, and serves as a pinnacle of the End is Nigh's evaluation-focused design.
The end is nigh, my friend. I will be brave.
But wait a minute, there's something missing here. See, this ending feels satisfying, but it's ultimately the same regardless of how many tumors the player collected. While there is a reason to collect some tumors, the game has yet to provide an incentive to collect any more tumors than absolutely necessary. If we revisit the acceptance warp point, however, the game's solution to this problem comes to light. When entering the menu to warp back to acceptance, players may notice something off. There's this gap in the menu that feels out of place. Sure, it's not the biggest thing, but in the warp menu for the worlds of the past, every part of the map is filled with something. There's no awkward gap like there is here. Then, when arriving in Acceptance, players may notice Ash being drawn towards the giant glowing orb. The last few rooms in Ruin featured a sort of wind-like mechanic which had Ash sliding towards the left side of the screen. It turns out that this mechanic was a sort of immense gravitational pull coming from the ball of energy itself. So, out of curiosity, what happens if we give in to gravity? Yeah, Ash dies, but his death wasn't normal. In fact, the energy ball drains all of Ash's tumors until he gets a game over, something which is not only highly time-consuming, but also highly unusual. This is the only death in the entire game that is drawn out to such a degree, and for a game as tightly made as this, there has to be a reason for it. Upon looking at the energy ball more closely, players may notice a small Roman numeral 5 imprinted on the ball. These numerals are identical to those imprinted on the signs outside of the Hungry Dudes in the past. If those guys required a minimum number of tumors to get to a secret future area, then players who discover this detail will likely assume that the same mechanic applies to this giant orb. This is, in fact, the case. The only way to get past this energy ball is to get every tumor in the overworld, totaling to 450. Jumping into this orb after collecting 450 tumors will transport players to the real final challenge of the game, appropriately titled Nevermore. Earlier in this video, 3 strategies were mentioned which developers can use to provide proper incentive for completion. While all 3 strategies work reasonably well on their own, they each have issues which have the potential to shut out players. The only way to truly provide justifiable incentive for all players to complete a game is to use all 3 strategies in a way where they complement each other. The End is Nigh does this. It uses UI elements when leaving this empty space to hint at a hidden world, and it clearly indicates what tumors still have yet to be collected in the past without divulging too much information. It also uses the Roman numeral 5 to associate a recurring visual element with gated content while not shoving the requirement in players' faces. It even associates this hidden area with its plot. After all, the opening cutscene established 2 goals for Ash, and thus far the game has only provided an avenue for the player to complete one of those goals. Ash found a friend and learned that this friend may not be best for him, but he still has yet to find his missing End is Nigh game cartridge. The only place this card could be is in the one area players have yet to explore. The key benefit of this area's implementation, however, is that the game still manages to feel complete without it. The ending to the End is Nigh after completing Acceptance feels satisfying all on its own, and as such, Nevermore acts more like a secret bonus than anything even remotely compulsory. The only thing that drives players to discover this area is their own curiosity, but it also feels like a satisfying conclusion which ties up some loose ends from Acceptance. In this way, it complements Acceptance without overwriting it. Also, like Acceptance, Nevermore functions well from a gameplay standpoint by testing evaluation on a larger macro scale in a way which affects all kinds of players. See, when the ball of energy takes 450 tumors to let you get into Nevermore, those lives don't come back. That leaves players with exactly 0 extra lives, forcing players to clear this incredibly difficult 15-room gauntlet in a single go. Thankfully, there's a security net in the form of collectibles which have gone unused up to this point. The cartridges. See, the cartridges found in each world are more than just a bonus collectible. They're fully playable on Ash's game console back at his house with extra tumors as rewards for completion. Technically speaking, these tumors have always been there. If you wanted a few extra chances back in, say, Anguish or Ruin, you could boot up one of these cartridges and have a go instead of tracking down a few stray tumors in the overworld. This also applies to the requirements for unlocking Nevermore, meaning that if a player was stuck on a particularly hard mega tumor, they wouldn't be locked out of this potentially more rewarding content, but would still have to earn it. The cartridges themselves are particularly interesting because they all serve to test mechanics which may have been a bit too gimmicky for the core game. The standard cartridges found in the pseudo-open world of the past serve to expand on the mechanics of the areas they're found in by introducing a ring collecting element and a limited lives system. These cartridges have the potential to award up to 4 tumors depending on how they are approached. The first tumor is awarded for just finishing the cart regardless of ring count, and the second and fourth tumors are awarded for collecting 50 and 100 rings respectively. The third tumor, meanwhile, requires players to not lose more than 9 lives, cleverly implementing this challenge through an arcade-inspired continue system. These 4 tasks directly work against each other, making for some interesting decision making. A player could go for all 100 rings and try and clear all of the challenges at once, but the likelihood of them doing this without using a continue is fairly slim. For some players, it may seem advantageous to make a 50 ring run first to familiarize oneself with the stages instead. None of these approaches are wrong, but the fact that there are different approaches at all makes for a much more flexible experience. There are also glitched cartridges which are accessible in the endgame worlds. Just getting these cartridges proves to be some of the most difficult content in the entire game. If getting through this ridiculous gauntlet of rooms in Ruin with a limited life count was hard enough, doing the exact same thing again in Acceptance with the countdown timer and violent screen shaking is a whole other thing entirely. These cartridges introduce gimmicks which simply wouldn't have fit in the main game at all, making for some incredibly fun gameplay. Starting up Pussman, for example, seems mundane enough at first. The title is a clear throwback to the 1980 arcade game Pac-Man, in the same way that standard cart Castlevania references the hit Konami action platformer game series. What players absolutely won't expect is a giant Pac-Man-like demon chomping up the stage as you try and make your way through it. Because these cartridges are so gimmicky and just plain bizarre, they serve to be fun experiences more than anything else. There's no limited life count, there's no larger evaluative consideration, just a stupidly fun time. Arguably, the best cartridges in the game come from the Hungry Dudes, the iron cartridges. These carts give the player one life and present some particularly tricky platforming. These cartridges in particular seem tailor-made for Nevermore, as they not only provide a tumor upon completion, helping make Nevermore slightly less impossible, but the nature of their challenge is also training in a way for the gauntlet. It's also so incredibly appropriate from a thematic standpoint that these cartridges are obtained by completing the future levels, as Nevermore is, in many ways, the 5th future level. Interestingly enough, however, the individual rooms in Nevermore are actually somewhat easier than many of the other challenges in the game. These rooms are harder than Ruin or Acceptance, sure, but they're not harder than the incredible feats necessary to obtain some of those cartridges or mega tumors. Rather, Nevermore instead focuses on the immense pressure that having such a limited life count entails. In essence, Nevermore not only has a moderately high execution difficulty, but an immensely high evaluation difficulty as well. This focus on evaluation makes Nevermore feel more complete in the way it presents challenge and fosters great satisfaction upon completion. The reward for finishing Nevermore is the very cartridge that opened the game.
Now, the only thing I remember from before, the end, was my right thumb. One day I slammed it in my car door and it half tore the nail off my thumb. It hurt like a bitch. Over time, like a week or so later, this little new nail started to grow underneath, and I was pushing the old nail out. It was just like hanging off. And I keep getting caught on my clothes, and I'd roll over when I was sleeping on it. It would hurt. And I just got aggravated and sick of it. And one day I just tore the nail off, and there was this little tiny shriveled thumbnail underneath, all gnarled and disgusting. I was wondering, was it ever going to grow back right? Was my thumb ever going to look normal again, or was this just going to be my thumb now for the rest of my life? I was picking at it when the bombs fell.
Anyone familiar with sheet music may have come across this text before, Da capo alla fine. Like many notations in classical music, this text is written in Italian. Classical music is heavily relevant to The End is Nigh, actually. Every single song in the game is a rearrangement of a famous piece from the classical and romantic eras, such as Franz Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, Peter Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, and Camille Saint-Saëns's Danse Macabre. There's a lot to say about this soundtrack. Many of the pieces here arguably surpass more authentic recordings of these compositions, but those discussions are irrelevant to the focus of this video. Right now, that focus is on these 4 words, which roughly translate as follows: back to the beginning, through to the end. This term is placed in sheet music to tell performers to go all the way back to the start of the piece and continue there until they encounter the word fine, which signals the end of the piece. Essentially, this term communicates to musicians that the end is actually at the beginning. This phrase doesn't actually exist in The End is Nigh anywhere, but if we were to picture this title as a massive classical piece, this notation would be placed at the end of Nevermore. That's because this cartridge, The End is Nigh, is the exact cartridge Ash was playing in the game's opening. And now, this cartridge can be played in Ash's game console in his house. A tumor can even be obtained by completing it. But why include this? What's the point? The answer, naturally, lies all the way back at the start of the game. The game opens with this exact cartridge, tasking players with clearing these absurdly difficult rooms before even getting used to the game's core mechanics. This setup is one of clear failure, with the player likely dying after a single jump. When the player dies, the game breaks, and Ash wakes up in the post-apocalypse. But what if a player could clear that cartridge? Would it break then? This challenge isn't given to the players within the game world. Like Nevermore, the only motivation to complete this ridiculous task is the player's own drive for completion, but the game provides enough breadcrumbs for players to latch onto. Cartridges clear without dying are adorned with a seemingly meaningless exclamation point, encouraging skilled players to practice their ability to marathon through long areas without dying. In addition, merely booting up the cart is in itself a sort of breadcrumb, as players will associate this cartridge with the live stream in the game's opening minutes. But despite the existence of these breadcrumbs, and like Nevermore, the existence of this challenge doesn't delegitimize the experience players could have by just clearing Acceptance or Nevermore. All of these options are equally valid and are treated as such. The key is that completing this optional content has to be rewarding for it to feel justified to players, something which most single-player games fail at entirely. After collecting 120 stars, Mario 64 rewarded players with a Yoshi and 99 lives. The former serves as an unsatisfying Easter egg, and the latter is ultimately pointless due to the lack of further content to lose those lives on, making for an incredibly unsatisfying reward. Macmillan and Glale concluded that the only truly satisfying way to reward players who fully complete the game's content is with some sort of narrative closure. The Acceptance ending feels legitimate, but it sort of had a loose end with the End is Nigh cartridge. Collecting it in Nevermore provides this closure, but it too had a loose end when viewing the cartridge through the lens of the game's opening. When challengers feel ready, they can test out their mastery of the End is Nigh cartridge by starting up a second game file. If they die anywhere during the cartridge will break as expected, but clearing the cart leads to the most appropriate form of narrative closure for a game like The End is Nigh.
There you go. Done. That was a lot easier than I expected. Anyway, this is Ash to anyone out there who may be watching this, saying, stay inside, kids!
And that's The End is Nigh. It's a title which demonstrates a near flawless balance between testing execution and evaluation, and uses those factors to develop a completion system which is rewarding for players of all types. A player with 0 tumors will find The End is Nigh as satisfying as a player with 501 tumors, and, thanks to the dynamic difficulty that this completion system provides, a player who prefers easier games has the potential to find The End is Nigh as satisfying as a player who prefers harder games. While this video has largely consisted of subjects like difficulty, evaluation, and completion, the real keyword here is control. Ultimately, regardless of the experience players expect or want, they have control over their own path through this game. The End is Nigh is an undeniably challenging game, but it is how players approach this challenge that makes the difference between a frustrating experience and a fun one. Back when Super Meat Boy released, there was one phrase which permeated all discussion of the game: when you die, it's your fault. This sentence seems to suggest that everyone should enjoy the title because everything that happens to the player is as a result of their actions. But in reality, this just isn't how the game functions. There are people who will like Super Meat Boy, and there are people who will not like Super Meat Boy. There is only one way forward, and players can either run along that path happily or be dragged along the path by their feet. Either way, the path itself stays the same. The phrase, when you die, it's your fault, applies to The End is Nigh, but it sort of misses the point. Unlike its spiritual predecessor, The End is Nigh asks players to forge their own path. It presents players with a well-tuned machine of a game and lets them decide what they want to do with it. There's never any pressure to do more than players want, but curiosity drives them further and further forward. Instead of subscribing a negative connotation to a player's enjoyment of the game, the sentence for The End is Nigh is something more akin to, when you succeed, it's your personal victory. Because everyone's experience with The End is Nigh is distinctly their own, an experience they carved out of an incredibly well-made product. One final thought. When discussing this game, Macmillan constantly said that it was inspired by, and was in many ways a representation of, his experience in game development. And given this game's incredibly dark tone, that seems particularly troubling at first. This is a game where, at its most basic level, the creation of something special, a friend, snowballs into something which results in the soul of its creator being torn from them and the collapse of their whole world twice over. This, in itself, doesn't appear to be a particularly pleasant interpretation, but I feel as if the true heart of this game lies somewhere deeper. The End is Nigh is a game about failure, but it isn't defined by that failure. Even after hours of investment and the destruction of the world you live in, there still may be hope. Maybe, in the darkest depths of your creation, there's a morsel of greatness, something which, if capitalized on, could make the entire journey worth it. You choose your own path. The end of your journey is nigh.
The end is nigh, my friend. I will be brave. Pick up the pieces of the dream I saved of me.
You should donate your clothes. No, like seriously. I mean, if you can find this box, donate your clothes in it. Because people need clothes. Okay, so anyway, hi. Thank you for watching this video. Pay attention to the credit scroll because there's a lot of people that helped out with this video. Like, I mean a lot of people. Credit to the people that helped me get that footage because it would have been really arduous for me to get it otherwise. I really don't just like pulling random footage from the internet. Also, my camera's about to die. I hope it doesn't die in the middle of this because that would suck. So anyway, I usually have 2 videos that I usually plug when I do these things. So let's do that. I do media analysis. I don't just make videos about video games. I make videos about film and music and TV and all this fun stuff. The last video I made was about this movie called Chronicle. It's one of my absolute favorite movies ever made, and I think there are a lot of topics surrounding that movie that just aren't discussed because people just view it as this superhero tragedy and don't really discuss anything else beyond that. So please go watch that video. It's really good. I mean, I'm biased, but I like it. The video I made before that is the other video I'm plugging. It's about reviews and journalism ethics. I am a journalism student. It's a video I'm really proud of because it kind of is not the culmination of everything I've learned in school. I've definitely learned a lot more than just journalism ethics, but college. I've definitely learned a lot more in journalism classes than just that, but it's a topic I'm really passionate about. I think I explained it well. I made most of my arguments well. There are only like 1 or 2 things that I regret a month or 2 later, which usually isn't the case. Usually I regret a lot more. So good on that. It's still one of my favorite videos that I've ever made. Now, as for what's coming next, I have no idea. I honestly have no idea. I have a video on my second channel that I made. It was this iPhone recorded video that I normally do. And I basically presented a bunch of ideas that I had. Some of those ideas I've actually started writing some more on those ideas. And I have a good idea of some stuff that I probably am more likely to do than other things. But usually I release like a teaser image on Twitter on what it is. So go follow me there if you're interested in what's next. That's all I got, and I don't want my camera to die. So I'm gonna bid you adieu now. Thank you for sticking with me through these 45 minutes, because this was a long one. Donate your clothes. I mean, if you want to.